Good morning. Good morning drive. So I'll be covering the British Columbia Lions as they take on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Just a review of that game. And what stuck out most to me is that although the score it was a considerable margin, one team performed a lot better than the other team. And when it comes to Canadian football, a lot of that has to do with the quarterback, but that's not the full story in this one. As we move on to this next slide, we'll talk about Rourke. So Rourke, he got injured at the end of the day, and it was an oblique injury. You can see in the top right corner there, the top right corner, you see the red damage. At least one of those obliques was damaged. My guess, based on how he crumpled down, is the his right side. Is what I believe. But he threw into triple coverage often, and this might be a sign that the Blue Bomber defense was able to stay in base mostly as they defended the run and the pass very effectively. In fact, I would say that Rourke's running is probably the best aspect of their rush attack. And the pass attack was ineffectual because we saw Rourke throwing into triple coverage at times, either as double to triple coverage, very often. And so I just was not impressed. I know that he's a great talent in the Canadian football at least, and I need to fight my prejudice against running quarterbacks generally because that is an aspect of Work's game that was perhaps the only highlight really for the Lions, if I'm being honest with you. And although my prejudice is well founded because later in the game he did eventually have his oblique exacerbated to the point that I don't know what he's going to be doing in the next week's game. He hit the ground straining after a throw, and to me, it seemed as though he got hit too many times. He allowed himself to get hit too many times. That's why I'm perfectly happy with him surveying the field like he did. He's really good at surveilling the field, but he needs to start considering throwing the ball away on first and second down and allowing that punter to pin back those Blue Bombers because the margin of the game was still not that considerable. He just would not stop allowing himself to get hit. Whereas if we look at somebody like and before we move on to Streveler, just take a look at he has one touchdown in that stat margin, okay? But that touchdown is questionable because the defender fell down. He actually was shoved down. He was out muscled. I'm not gonna. I don't care that happened. I don't care that should have been a penalty. Who cares? Is where I'm at because I live in Michigan, of course. I do like Ontario, by the way. Ontario has a very similar culture to Michigan. We both played euchre, for instance. But you see, something good to take away from Nathan Rourke's game is that he targeted his receiver. He spread the ball out across his receivers. That's what I'm looking at right there. Is he's able to spread the ball out, but we're going to talk about someone who I thought was more effective. Now, did they have a similar stat line? Yes, but I think that the better quarterback today was Streveler because he was in the correct system to succeed. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, and we'll see that he spread out his targets well, and he was able to have a comparable game. Well, 3 touchdowns. I mean, I guess comparable. It felt like comparable game stat wise was what I was saying, but even stat line, you see there's a big difference. And now you might see the long throws 35 for this guy and 70 for the other guy. Mostly that's yards after catch. Now, if the ball is traveling in the air, 35 yards or to 70 yards, well, okay, I guess we have like a Ravens quarterback there throwing 70 to 80 yards. That is considerable. But you have to think of yards after catch after that receiver catches the ball, right? In any case, he was provided a nice system to throw the ball for Winnipeg because there was some balance. He was put in a place that leads to comfort, is what I'm saying. He was very impressive. He had a very impressive touchdown pass where he hit the back corner wall of that end zone, and he was able to do that, in my opinion, because he was throwing a bunch of passes that were easy throws. And you could say along of 35, he threw a lot of easy throws. Not a bad thing. And point number two, look at the average there, 10 yards per throw. Generally, when you look at average yards per throw, I want you to really consider that anything above 7 yards is good, but anything below 7 yards is bad. And 10 yards is a pretty good one. Okay, in any case, I liked that Winnipeg had a balanced offense, at least relative to British Columbia, that seemed so rigid and inflexible with their game plan. I'm not a fan of their coaching staff, based on what I see in one game at least. And so you take that with a grain of salt. Based on what I've seen in one game, I'm not impressed. But take that grain of salt and consider this little granule of a concept here. Every game matters. And this was Winnipeg's first game, and they looked sharp. They looked sharp. They had what they called a bye week in the first week, and yeah, I get it. But the other team, coming off their first game, a win last week, the British Columbia Lions, they looked like they were struggling to figure out Winnipeg's attack, and there must have been some time for this film study, right? And they had no malleability. They were just focused on the same type of passing scheme that wasn't working in the first half, and then the second half it finally hit. But there was zero balance with the running. In any case, let's move on. I'm sorry. One thing that I disliked about both teams before, I can move on to the next slide. But one thing that I didn't like about both sides is that they need to start timing the hike with the receivers running up to the line. You see that receivers would sort of stop and go to not be offsides. Well, a few times they were offsides, but it wasn't called. Other times it was just like, they were getting into a jog and then they had to slow down and then jog again, which is almost worse than starting from zero in NFL football and then running off the sort of your heel. If anything, it hurts a route runner, and it almost emboldens the defensive coverage to have the edge, whereas it should be a huge edge for the offense. So think of it that way. Another thing that I noticed was that just 1 second, I have to do something real quick. Oh, gotcha. So yeah, usually I don't do jump cuts, but here's what it is. I noticed that Streveler and the Blue Bombers had a running concept where they hand off to Peterson here, Matthew Peterson, and nobody is it took them maybe 5 seconds of real time to hand the ball off to the guy. At least it felt like that, and nobody would have been fooled by the concept. It wasn't like military efficient or SWAT team efficient, like hit the hole now, and or don't hit the hole now, but here's a counter play. There was one run in particular that looked very unprofessional. It looked like pee-wee football. And everything else was very professional by the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Believe me that. But this is something they have to work on. They handed the ball so slowly, and by the time they handed the ball off, nobody was like, okay, getting the running back, hitting the hole and getting through. It was so slow and choppy of a handoff that basically everything is a bit of a surprise in the run game in Canadian football, almost to the point that they should have been more efficient with the handoff, and it should have hit the hole. I can't stress to you how bad that was. But on to better things. The real standout in this game was Peterson here. And he was able to rack up a bunch of yards, and he effectively made Streveler's game more effective. I believe he played for North Dakota at a certain point. Very strong American program in the FCS, which is the second level, lower level, just off the first tier is the second tier of college football. And he made his game so much easier. They balanced each other. It was just a very good performance. I don't have much else to say on that. Besides that, I really enjoyed watching Canadian football. I'm one of those old people, that I like to see defensive football matches. But this certainly has a place. I think the Canadian football has a really good watch for any fan of North American football because they're not like me. They don't have this sense of soccer or my preference defensive football like the old school Ravens versus Steelers where it's like, oh my God, it's 10-10 or 7-10. Can they just get that field goal? Can they just get that rouge, if you will? And anyways, before I leave, let's go ahead and do a transcription, a little bit of so that our Canadian viewers from Quebec, the Quebecois, can understand what I'm saying before I leave. The game was excellent. I can't believe that it was so much fun. But let's go ahead and look at the final score here. There you go. I'm wondering where... Let's give you some stats before I go. Sorry about that. First video. You know what's annoying? I actually made this slide, and then I had to make it a second time just mid-stream. Well, not stream. Well, anyways, mid-recording. And here you can have a look at the stats. Stats can be sort of deceptive to the end result. And, it was a close game. I think that the wide receivers for British Columbia have to get open. I think that it's more of a schematic issue because there was provided a lot of time by those offensive linemen. Truth be told, the British Columbia Lions, their offensive linemen protected the quarterback fairly well. It's sort of the quarterback himself that said, I'm going to be the hero. He is a fast runner, but come on, buddy. You're going to get hit. You're going to get hurt. And he got hurt. I just knew this guy was going to get hurt eventually. Because if you play this sport, you know that if you can hit the quarterback especially, you want to leave an impact. And they left an impact. It wasn't like they went out to try to injure the guy, but they went out and injured the guy. Okay, so that's what I'm saying to you. But I liked the pass protection. I think that their quarterback is still talented. But in the end, if you glean any added information from this stat line, I got you. But if you watch the game, it was the Blue Bombers all the way. And that's the final score. It was Winnipeg Blue Bombers 34, British Columbia Lions 20. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Bye for now. I don't do promotions. I don't self-promote, but let's hope that this was a fun video. As well, I cover the UFL in the next video today because there's a championship afoot south of the border between District of Columbia Defenders and the Michigan Panthers. When they say Michigan, they mean Detroit. And anyways, bye for now. Oh, and for the Quebecois, bye for now.